Guess who's back? Back again. Today, I'm here to talk to you lovely folks about a lovely little episode titled The Wolf and the Lion. This is the 5th episode from the first season, and most of the time is dedicated to all the politicking and scheming in King's Landing. The audience's perspective remains primarily focused on Ned as he continues his investigation of Jon Arryn's death, but the show still finds time to fling us around the map, letting us get to know these characters better and learn a lot more about the world they inhabit. We get introduced to Lady Lysa and this handsome lad. We get the very first Clegane Bowl, which is swiftly outdone by this verbal sparring session between Varys and Littlefinger. We get some great exposition between Bran and Lumen, immediately followed by some great sexposition between Theon and Ros. And to top it all off, as if you needed more, the Mad Lads gave us King Bobber at his absolute best. And like our esteemed rotundness, this episode is one dense boy, meaning there's a lot to cover, so enough of the pomp, let's have at it. This episode opens on Ned returning to the tournament grounds and visiting his now dead lead, Sir Hugh of the Vale. Sir Hugh was the squire of the recently deceased Jon Arryn, and he was knighted and came into money shortly after his former master died. Ned points out that the dead knight's armor is brand new, and Barristan adds that it sure was bad luck for him that he went up against the mountain. But this all appears a little too inconvenient for Ned's investigation to be mere coincidence. Cersei confronted him for snooping around in the last episode, so the Lord of Winterfell is fairly certain this is part of the Lannister conspiracy. This may seem super suspicious, but even with the show ended, we don't really know what role, if any, Sir Hugh had in Jon Arryn's death, or if Sir Hugh's death was orchestrated the way Ned and the viewer are led to think it is. The safest guess is that Sir Hugh was Littlefinger's spy at one point, and he actually had no direct involvement in Jon Arryn's death. He was probably just paid to spy on Jon and knew about the incest reveal, but I don't think he actually knew enough to expose Littlefinger's plot. Littlefinger gifted him this armor specifically because the helmet is shit, and paid the Strawholder guy to make sure that he faced off with the mountain. I don't think Peter needed Sir Hugh to die, but he knew he could put the newly made knight in a very risky situation, and if he did die, use his death as a red herring to throw Ned further off his trail and onto Cersei's. Littlefinger has a drunken kung fu style of conspiracy, where he will often maneuver in deliberately unpredictable ways to mask his true motives, frequently resulting in his actions being blamed on other great houses and stirring up conflict that he can then benefit from. At the same time, Sir Hugh could be completely innocent since we don't actually know who knighted him. It could have been Robert like it was in the books, and if he served well enough, why wouldn't Jon Arryn leave him some cash? When I first watched, I readily blamed Cersei for Hugh's death, which I think was the point. Because on a rewatch, not only is it unclear who actually caused this, but it becomes apparent that that's not what matters. What matters is that Ned's suspicion is entirely focused on the Lannisters, with his biggest threat now sitting comfortably in his blind spot. Game of Thrones is a show that's all about perspective. Well, it's about a lot of things, but perspective is definitely one of them. What ultimately causes Ned's death is a lack of perspective. Sure, he earned it through several honorable but ill-advised choices, but equally to blame are his numerous mistakes and errors in judgment. Chief among them, trusting someone who sounds like a literal snake.
Council business. Unless...
There is no unless.
And now for something completely different.
I just want to compliment all the world building that happens on screen without taking any time or attention away from the main events. The Silent Sisters, these strange nuns who handle the bodies of dead nobility, show up several times but are never given some clunky explanation. They're more of a background element anyway, so everything you need to know about them is already being communicated visually. Them not responding to Ned clues you into the vows of silence they've taken, and their mouths being covered leaves you to wonder if maybe they're missing their tongues altogether. Barristan's white cloak gets the same treatment. He keeps it on throughout the season, well, until he doesn't, but before his epic resignation, he's always wearing it. So the fact that he leaves it outside of the death tent with his squire is a pretty cool detail, and I think it becomes an awesome detail when you realize that the show doesn't call any attention to it. It just kind of happens, and it's something I totally missed the first time. But seeing it again, it makes perfect sense, because it hints at the reverence Kingsguard have for their cloaks and the superstition Westerosi have towards death. They do some walking and talking, Ned hyping Barristan up as a legendary fighter, something that will sadly never truly be paid off. At the mention of Ned's father, Sir Barristan offers his condolences for what the Mad King did to him and Ned's brother. Ned dodges Barristan's sympathy, staying on business, pointing out that Sir Hugh was a squire until very recently, and wondering how he could afford such a nice new set of armor. Barristan brushes off Ned's suspicion, saying it just be like that sometimes, before adding that King Robert wants to joust in today's tournament. Ned says, "Nuh-uh, not gonna happen," and Barristan replies that the king tends to get his way, but Ned retorts that
If the king got what he wanted all the time, he'd still be fighting a damned rebellion.
this line is a great setup for the following scene and what it's all about, and to a slightly lesser extent, it sets up the entire episode, as this episode focuses a lot on Robert's true desires and his inability to satisfy them. Ned enters Robert's tent to find the king's squire struggling to cram so much royalty into such little armor. Lancel tells the king the armor simply won't fit while carefully avoiding calling him fat, but the king still reacts poorly.
Your mother was a dumb whore with a fat ass.
Robert turns to Ned to ridicule Lancel some more, and Ned speaks in the squire's defense.
You're too fat for your armor.
Fat? Is that how you speak to your king?
When Lancel dares to let out a meager chuckle,
You heard the hand. The king's too fat for his armor. Go find the breastplate stretcher. Now!
it's a good bit, but honestly, I think Ned's follow-up is even better.
Maybe you should have one invented.
All right.
And now we get to the meat of the scene, and address what Ned said earlier.
If the king got what he wanted all the time,
Robert really wants to joust, but Ned tells him he's not allowed. Robert says, actually, I am allowed, I'm the king. But Ned points out that even if he does manage to squeeze his kingly figure into some armor and get on a horse, no one is going to risk hurting him in combat. And while this is something Robert should definitely be aware of already, seeing as how he totally would have tried this before, this scene explores a critical side to his character. All season, we've seen Robert fuck around and seemingly indulge in his simple desires, but this episode really gets to the question of what does Robert want? If he wanted to kill people or hurt them, he could just do it. Yeah, Robert is a violent person, but he's no sadist like Joffrey. He doesn't want to just wail on some helpless punching bag, he wants a challenge. To relive the thrill he experienced winning the throne. For context, let's speedrun Robert's backstory. He was orphaned at a young age and raised by Jon Arryn to be the future Lord of Storm's End. While he was being raised there at the Eyrie, Ned Stark was also sent there as a ward. There, at the ripe old age of 8, Robert and Ned became close friends, sparking a legendary bromance that would endure for the rest of their lives. Robert lost his parents at a very young age and never connected with his blood relatives. Later in life, he fails to connect with his wife or any of her children. In his heart, his family only ever consisted of Ned and Jon Arryn.
You were the brother I chose.
In adulthood, Robert became infatuated with Ned's sister Lyanna, but after they were betrothed, she got kidnapped by Prince Rhaegar and both of them vanished. When Ned's father and brother traveled to the Red Keep to demand her return, Rhaegar's father, the Mad King, had the two of them brutally murdered. Fearing retribution, the king demanded from Jon Arryn the heads of Robert and Ned. Instead, Jon Arryn raised his banners against the capital and sought to remove King Aerys from power. This rebellion saw the Targaryens all but destroyed, with Robert in his prime leading the charge. Tywin Lannister, who had been loyal to the king up until that point, turned on the crown at the end of the war and ordered the Mountain to kill the Targaryen heirs and their mother. The Mountain obliged and did so in a particularly fucked up fashion. This greatly upset Ned, but Robert refused to hold Tywin, Gregor, Jaime, or any of the Lannisters accountable for their villainy, causing a big rift between him and Ned. A rift that only widened when Ned found Lyanna on her deathbed and took in Jon Snow. After seeing Robert condone such brutality against children, he couldn't trust him not to visit the same vengeance upon the bastard son of Rhaegar.
I'll kill every Targaryen I get my hands on.
Ned returned to Winterfell, and at the suggestion of Jon Arryn, Robert married Tywin's daughter and has spent the last 20 years spiraling into a hedonistic depression. Robert may be king, but he isn't completely free. These may be peace times, but what Robert really wants is...
Great big tits you could bury your face in.
Whoops, wrong clip. What Robert really wants is...
I want to hit somebody.
Robert is a simple man who was really good at killing people, which got him the throne, but now that he has it, he's pretty miserable. He has no talent or passion for legislation, and he doesn't like any of the people at court. Robert laments that,
I thought being king meant I could do whatever I wanted.
unfortunately for Robert, this isn't that kind of story. As jovial and as fun as he is, Robert is a tragic character. He sits on the highest seat of authority imaginable, but now yearns for the days of his rebellion.
I knocked him down with the hammer. God, I was strong then.
A time where he felt much more driven and powerful, and the prospect of ruling Westeros appeared to be his way of achieving his happily ever after. This episode will delve deeper into his psyche, but I'm covering events chronologically, so...
We get there when we get there!
After seeing the Mountain one-shot Sir Hugh in the last episode, Sansa is understandably concerned for Loras' safety, but Ned tells her not to worry. Sir Loras has a helmet that actually covers his face, though I don't know if he can really see while wearing it. Quick props to the costume design, especially on the suits of armor. They look amazing, and both sets give you an immediate sense of the characters' reputations as knights. Loras's is ornately crafted, yet looks a bit thin and light, alluding to his house's carefully maintained facade of purity, and the Mountain's armor is crude, dark, and imposing, just like the foul creature underneath.
Hey, Vsauce, Michael here.
The joust commences, and Loras manages to knock over the Mountain's horse. As Loras completes his victory lap, the Mountain unsheathes his sword, unheads his horse, and unhorses Loras. Despite the presence of several Kingsguard, it is the Hound who steps in and saves Loras. The two duel for a while before the king finally interferes, and I love how Robert takes a bit too long to step in. This is the first real fight he's seen in years, and he's so enraptured by it that he either briefly forgets or ignores that it's his job to break this up. Robert would have loved the tournament in House of the Dragon. The good old days, am I right, Bobby? Gotta love how the Hound's instant submission to the will of his king is what saves him. After establishing him as a cold, ruthless murderer, this scene highlights his redeeming qualities. His altruism and his courage, his compassion for the innocent, and his willingness to risk his own life for others. And it's capped off with an epic display of his humility and loyalty, foiled by his brother's pride as he childishly tosses his sword down and storms off. Loras says, "I owe you my life, sir," and the Hound replies with, "I'm no sir," telling us about his attitude towards knighthood. These elements of his character get fleshed out more in Season 2, so that's all I'll say about him for now. In the previous episode, Tyrion bumped into Cat at the Inn of the Crossroads, where she decided on the spot to arrest him for allegedly conspiring to kill her son. Cat catches a lot of flack from the wider audience, and while most of it is pretty justified, this spontaneous decision to abduct the dwarf isn't nearly as ill-conceived as many seem to think it is. In fact, considering she made this plan with less than a minute to think it through, it's pretty good. For context, after Ned left for King's Landing, an assassin was sent to kill Bran. An assassin armed with a very fancy Valyrian steel dagger that doesn't deserve to be discussed any more than it already has been. Catelyn does some digging and suspects a Lannister conspiracy, so she personally goes to King's Landing to warn her husband about it.
Why?
You know what, we'll get to that later. There, Littlefinger tells the Starks that the dagger was once his, but he lost it in a bet to Tyrion Lannister. Cat is fully convinced by this, so when she bumps into Tyrion, we have to first consider what she fears if she lets him go. From where she's standing, this might be her best and only opportunity to exact justice on the person she thinks is responsible for paralyzing her son. Once Tyrion gets to King's Landing, he'll be untouchable. At present, she's also worried for the safety of her husband and daughters. The Lannisters have 3 of their family members in their territory, while Catelyn has no such leverage. But by yoinking Tyrion, she can potentially barter for Ned's life if he comes under threat, which, if things had gone even a bit differently, could have worked. It almost does. Obviously, this would cause some blowback at court, but Cat couldn't have expected that Ned would quit his job at the worst possible moment, which is what left him vulnerable to Jaime's assault. And Cat does attempt to do this in an official capacity, citing the king's justice as she makes the arrest. The real biggest hole in this plan is how much it relies on Lysa's cooperation, which turned out to be far more of a gamble than Cat expected. Lysa isn't the best person to lean on to begin with, but Cat has spent a lot of time away from her sister, and has no idea the plot she's involved in or how much kookier she's become. All things considered, this was a somewhat desperate maneuver, but by no means dumb or reckless, just a bit poorly conceived. And as always, there's the small stuff. This guy, Marillion, is the same bard who loses his tongue in the finale for making fun of Cersei and Robert in one of his songs. And here we get some silent characterization for Bronn. He first appears in the scene where Tyrion gets abducted. Tyrion is told all the rooms at the inn are taken, and when he puts out an open offer to pay extra for someone else's room, Bronn is the one who accepts, immediately establishing his primary motivator.
Money, gonna make some money.
And here, when Tyrion mentions that his father would pay handsomely for his release, Bronn's attention is briefly pulled away from the knife he's sharpening, nicely visualizing his cutthroat and opportunistic nature. Tyrion insists he had no involvement in the assassination attempt, and Catelyn starts to say that the dagger carried by the assassin belonged to him. But Tyrion, being the logic lord he is, says,
What sort of imbecile arms an assassin with his own blade?
A surprise attack ensues, and Tyrion convinces Catelyn to cut him loose so he can better defend himself. At one point, Tyrion saves Catelyn from an attacker by grabbing a shield and sticking him with Season 1, Episode 7. And it's an alright moment, but I wished something came of it, because Tyrion made a valid point earlier.
What if imbecile arms an assassin with his own blade?
And he just went out of his way to protect the woman who abducted him, but we don't get to see Cat show any kind of skepticism about his guilt following this incident, which I think is a missed opportunity, one that bleeds into all the time we spend at the Eyrie in Season 1. It could have been really interesting if Cat gradually became less convinced of Tyrion's guilt throughout his trial, to the point where the sisters begin clashing on how Tyrion should be handled. Or at least some kind of drama or one-on-one interaction between them during the trial. Because ultimately, this plotline is fun and it does flesh out the setting and characters, but it ends up being a very minor detour that mostly services other events while not being given enough of its own time to explore what could have been some juicy character drama between Tyrion and the Tully sisters. This next scene is perfect. Nothing too exciting, but what's being achieved through this conversation is straight up impressive. When you're writing a story, characters can explicitly lay out how they feel and what motivates them, or basic information about the world that they inhabit, but getting a character to do that in an organic way takes work that a lot of writers aren't willing or able to put in. So the fact that even trivial conversations like this still have dialogue that accomplishes so many things storytelling-wise is so awesome, and it's why this show is so great. Most of the show is conversations. Conversations of varying importance to both the respective viewer and the wider plot, but the variation in quality is almost non-existent. It's all so good. Let's break down what makes this scene work. We open with a shot of this target, which Theon is firing arrows into. Behind him, Maester Lumen is seated beside Bran with a map stretched out on the table in front of them. Maester Lumen is giving a lesson as evident by his lesson stick, and when we cut to Bran, he's halfway watching Theon, fidgeting with something in his hand, can't quite make out what it is yet, and having drifted away from the lesson. Lumen recovers his attention and impatiently taps the map. Bran replies by listing off what he's supposed to know about the location and the house that rules there. The Iron Islands, Sigil O'Kraken, words we do not sow. Bran looks down at the table and continues to fidget as he gives the answer, clearly dwelling on something else. Mentioning the Greyjoys isn't really needed since we relearn all this in Season 2 when Theon travels to Pike, but bringing it up now provides a great chance for Theon to interject and let us know how he feels about his birth house. And well, he thinks they're great, which is going to be important in just a few minutes. And the fact that he interjects at all, and in the smug manner that he does, gives you a bit of his character. It reminds you that he's proud, and that a lot of that pride stems from his heritage. We finally get a glimpse of what Bran is fidgeting with, and wouldn't you know it, it's a Tully sigil. You don't have to know what's coming to know exactly what's bothering Bran. Bran's dismissive attitude turns to agitation as he continues to answer questions. They reach House Lannister, and Bran makes the same mistake that most viewers naturally would.
A Lannister always pays his debts.
No. A common saying, but not their official motto.
When he tells Lumen he doesn't know the Lannisters' actual words, Lumen appears exasperated. Between this and the tapping, we can assume this lesson has been going on for a while now, and both student and teacher have been gradually chipping away at each other's patience. Bran begins to rapid-fire words from random houses, pretending to guess at the right ones, basically refusing to engage with the lesson until Lumen finally addresses what's bothering him. The third phrase he says is family, duty, honor.
Those are Tully words, your mother's. Are we playing a game?
Bran points out that family comes first in those words, and his lip quivers. Lumen reassures Bran that she only left to protect the family, and that his mother stayed by his side for 3 weeks during his coma. To which Bran replies,
And then she left.
Before he fell, Bran was supposed to go to King's Landing with his dad and his sisters, so he could start training to become a knight, just like he had always dreamed. Instead, he wakes up to find out his dad left without him, he's paralyzed for the rest of his life, and his mom has gone on a super secret mission and he doesn't know why she left or when she's going to be coming back.
That's rough, buddy.
Which would be devastating for any child, so it's understandable that he doesn't care to hear how long his mom puppy guarded his bedside when she bailed right before he needed her most. At least from his perspective. Lumen can't tell Bran why she left, and honestly, I can't either. I mean, I can, but the best reasons I can come up with are not in universe. There was no need to personally travel to King's Landing. Send Sir Roderick with some men and a letter. I mean, maybe I'm being unfair. Let's hear her reasoning.
I don't trust a raven to carry these words.
I'll ride to King's Landing.
No, I will go myself.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
Mother, you can't.
I must.
But why?
And Sir Roderick has to insist on coming along, and she looks to Lumen as if she has to make sure that that is a good idea. Like, Kat seriously wanted to make the journey by herself. That is stupid and irresponsible, neither of which Kat is supposed to be. If I'm missing something, let me know in the comments, but this seems like Kat just breaking character for the sake of making necessary contributions to the plot. Anyway, Bran's eyes wander back to Theon, who is still loosing arrows into the target, and now that he's uncorked his feelings, Bran openly laments that he'll never shoot a bow again. But Lumen says that if the Saddle Tyrion design works properly, he'll be able to shoot a bow from horseback. The Little Lord is skeptical for a moment, but Lumen tells him that Dothraki boys start learning as early as 4, which is honestly even more doubtful, but this embellishment brings Bran some much needed hope. Just like that, we've given the audience some fun facts about the setting, we see how Bran is coping with his disability and the author's decision to separate him from his mother, and we prime Theon for the coming scene. It may not be that consequential or interesting, but on a technical level, it's still just so excellent. And before the scene ends, we are shown the target Theon has just riddled with arrows. They're all just near the bullseye, none of them actually hitting center. Here, his aim is off as he tests his accuracy and blusters about his people's famed archery skills, but later on, he nails a shot to save Bran's life, showing that he's capable of coming through when necessary. This also hints at his feelings of shame, his perceived failure to live up to his Greyjoy name, which is what this whole next scene is about. Although he was raised by the very lovely residents of Winterfell, this same faction killed his brothers and put his house to shame when they tried to claim independence. And no Iron Islander feels that shame more than Theon. Theon tries at several intervals to voice pride in his house, and the people of Winterfell seem to enjoy vibe-checking him at every juncture.
My father is Balon Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands.
What's that got to do with you?
Shame how it all turned out.
We were outnumbered 10 to 1.
A stupid rebellion, then. I suppose your father realized that when your brothers died in battle.
Famed for their skills at archery, navigation, and lovemaking.
And failed rebellions.
He can't take his frustration out on most of the people talking down to him, so instead he takes it out on Ros.
I'm a Greyjoy. There's not a family in Westeros that can look down on us.
What about the Starks?
I've been Lord Stark's ward since I was 8 years old.
That's a nice word for it. Your father rebelled against King Robert.
My father fought for the freedom of his people.
And for anybody curious, if he hadn't cut her off, this is what she was going to say.
And if my father rebelled again, Lord Eddard Stark would take his sword and cut off my head.
And while it doesn't matter to the wider plot yet, it kinda does matter to the wider plot yet, because we're laying the seeds for all those important decisions Theon is going to make later. And the cherry on top is that this is a show-only scene. It's a Dave and Dan original. Good on them, but this is further proof that they could have given us a decent ending if they hadn't run out of fucks to give. Roz's relationship with Theon gives us a sneak peek at how Theon will puff himself up and violently lash out to try and change people's image of him, how he will try to embody the principles of his house, and how ultimately his efforts will fail.
I don't want to pay for it.
Get yourself a wife.
We cut back to King's Landing, and the Spider is talking to Ned in his office, asking how Bran is. Ned tells him that Bran will never walk again. Varys asks if Bran's mind is sound, and Ned replies that it is. During this friendly icebreaker, rather than have Varys just sitting there, he's ominously closing the shutters and door, adding interest to the scene as soon as it starts, setting the mood for the impending conversation, and letting us know he's about to spill some royal tea. It also further characterizes him as a cunning and cautious spy master, and all the while dropping some serious foreshadowing about Bran's lofty destiny.
Some doors close forever, others open in most unexpected places.
It's a pretty insignificant moment, but this is just impeccable storytelling. So much is being accomplished in such a short amount of time. He sits down and gets straight to the point. The king is in danger and Jon Arryn was poisoned.
I've been in the capital a month. Why have you waited so long to tell me this?
Varys responds that he wasn't sure if he could trust him. But even now, Varys is playing his cards close. He drops several hints trying to divert some of Ned's suspicion to Littlefinger.
Who gave it to him?
Some dear friend, no doubt, but which one? There was one boy. All he was, he owed to Jon Arryn.
Who paid Sir Hugh?
Someone who could afford it.
Sadly, Ned is oblivious to all the hints, and it seems his certainty of Lannister conspiracy has demonstrated to Varys that Peter has already pocketed the Nedster as a pawn, so the Spider doesn't go so far as to name-drop Peter. Shortly thereafter, Arya is chasing cats as part of Syria's lesson, and finds herself in the dungeons. While there, she hears people approaching and hides. The men approaching turn out to be Varys and Illyrio. Now, talking about Varys is a bit tricky, because he's supposed to be mysterious and confusing. His actions aren't supposed to make sense until his true nature is laid bare in the final act. The issue is that when you watch the show, the final act veers off in a completely different direction than what was being set up. And you can't fill these gaps using the books because A, the show has a different continuity from the very start, so certain details don't map on cleanly, and B, the books aren't finished. So it means we have two versions of Varys, and neither of them make total sense. I will one day try to untangle the enigma that is this character, but for now, let's keep things as simple as possible. In this episode, we learn that Illyrio and Varys are co-conspirators, which is a big reveal because we last saw Illyrio arranging the marriage between Dany and Khal Drogo, and Varys has been the one informing Robert of these developments. Varys tells Illyrio that war is inevitable, and Illyrio responds that they aren't ready to enact their plans yet. In response, Varys says, "Delay you say, move fast I reply. This is no longer a game for two players." After this conversation, Robert has been informed that Dany is Pregos. Varys warns Jorah of the impending assassination attempts, and when Jorah prevents one, the attempt enrages Drogo to the point of declaring war, as he vows to sail to Westeros and invade it. And this is where things get weird. Early on, it seems like Varys and Illyrio are successfully setting up the Targaryens and the Dothraki to enter the conflict, and the obvious question arises, really Varys? Dany? You really want Dany on the throne? You obviously didn't want Viserys with how little you protected or prepared him. Also, isn't this a lot of risk to be putting her through if she is the endgame? And in the show, yeah, Varys chooses to side with Dany because
a group of people who saw Robert Baratheon for the disaster he was. We tried to do what was best for the realm by supporting a Targaryen restoration.
Because Robert was just that big of a disaster? Really, guys? Varys served under the Mad King, but Robert's drunken shenanigans, that's a step too far. We need the Mad King's daughter to come save us from this nightmare that is Robert Baratheon. Give me a fucking break. But in the books, this hole is mostly plugged up by the real secret plan, to install Aegon, the supposed son of Rhaegar, on the throne. A boy that has been kept safe and educated his entire life. Someone Varys and Illyrio have deliberately raised to be an appealing claimant and a good ruler. You know The Incredibles? You know how Syndrome's plan is to create a robot that wipes out the other superheroes and then send that robot to the city to wreak havoc so he can defeat it in public for everyone to see so he's the best hero? This is basically that plan. Varys will soften up the realm from the inside, weakening and eliminating Aegon's potential competition, and then when the Dothraki show up, Aegon can come in and act as a savior. Which makes way more sense because it's hard to believe all of Varys' grand plans to improve the realm just amount to putting another crazy Targaryen in charge, especially one he has had such little oversight or control over. I will take this opportunity to address a common sentiment among fans, one that kinda bugs me. That being that show Varys is super lame compared to the books because they made him a quote-unquote good guy. While Varys says in both the show and book that he just wants what's best for the realm, the show version makes it clear that he has no ulterior motive. No secret family ties or personal desires for power, just good old-fashioned altruism. And yeah, a lot of people think this is somehow shallow or boring, but I wholeheartedly disagree. If anything, I think it makes him stand out against the wide array of cynical and selfish nobility who surround him, and it makes his actions more impactful as you feel torn between rooting for him to betray his methods and show loyalty to an ally, or to stay the course and keep making smart decisions that preserve his goals. What makes him so compelling to me, until the very last episode of season 4, is that he blurs the line between hero and villain. He's wholly dedicated to seeing his vision through, no matter how many friends or enemies he has to cycle through to get there, which is a trait almost always ascribed to more villainous and malevolent characters, so it's refreshing to see on someone with more noble intentions. Speaking of more villainous and malevolent characters, these little verbal sparring sessions between the two spy masters are iconic.
I distinctly recall seeing you talking to Lord Stark in his chambers.
Was that you under the bed?
One shudders at the thought.
Here are two of the most influential people in the entire realm, and their main currency is information. Both come from humble backgrounds and are vastly underestimated by the lords that they claim to serve. There's a mutual respect and admiration there, but also a tense rivalry, as both are uniquely aware of the other's power level, which makes the facade of friendly banter so much fun.
Should pay a visit to my brothel this evening. First boy is on the house.
What I find interesting about the pedo accusations coming from Littlefinger is that he would probably know by now if they were true. After all these years of working together and monitoring each other, Peter would have some evidence. So I think this is him, true to form, taking yet another gamble, hoping that Varys will either let slip how much he knows about Littlefinger's brothels, which is what happens, or that Varys will go, finally, a man who can service my needs, and then Peter can expose or entrap him. Instead, Varys basically says, that's cute, but I could bury you if I wanted. And perhaps this is Peter concealing his power level a bit, implying to Varys that his network isn't that airtight if he's deferring to what are fairly stock standard public rumors. But Varys is careful to give him no satisfaction, either unconvinced of Littlefinger's feigned ignorance or apathetic to it. Baelish doubles down, assuring Varys that his brothel accommodates all desires. Varys replies with this.
I heard the most awful rumor about a certain lord with a taste for fresh cadavers.
Which is kind of illegal for brothel Baelish to be accommodating.
Strictly speaking, such a thing would not be in accordance with the king's laws.
Strictly speaking.
Does someone somewhere keep your balls in a little box?
Do you know, I have no idea where they are, and we had been so close.
Littlefinger, more like Big Mad. However, that's only on the surface. If you keep track, Littlefinger just traded a standard issue public rumor for a specific piece of dirt from Varys, one that he can now account for before Varys actually capitalizes on it. And it seems Peter is digging for a bit more. He may have had a snappy comeback for it, but this little insult does still manage to get Varys pulled back into the conversation.
What are you, deaf and stupid? I said no! What's wrong, McFly? Chicken?
He takes the bait and enters this little spy-off with Peter, remarking that it would be rather unfortunate if the Starks somehow came to the conclusion that the Lannisters were responsible for the attempt on Bran's life, and that it would be even more unfortunate if Baelish was outed as the one who helped them reach that conclusion. But Peter's response catches him completely off guard.
That's when I saw you escorting a certain foreign dignitary. Of course, you would have friends from across the narrow sea.
And Varys can't even hide his dread. Yeah, this plotline gets morphed into Varys rooting for Dany, but at the time, this was pretty sick. Seeing Varys roll with every punch like it's nothing, only for Littlefinger to pull this card and put him on the back foot in an instant, was dope as hell. It's cool to see Varys lose his composure, because the idea of Littlefinger tampering with his pet project is that terrifying. And it made me really curious to see what both of them were trying to cook up. These two foil each other very well, since Varys' motivations are largely altruistic, while Littlefinger's are entirely self-serving. Renly interrupts the conversation and tells them to hurry to the small council meeting, because Robert is actually showing up to this one. Arya steps out of the Red Keep sewers and begins making her way back inside through the nearest gate. A central theme to Arya's character is identity, and this is meant to tie in very nicely to the cult of face-changing assassins she will later join. Right now, she's probably the single most important person in King's Landing who isn't currently within the castle walls, yet no one even glances her way because her appearance is so plain and she's covered in dirt. There's a pair of guards outside the gate she enters, and she strolls right past them without any issue. And when she's stopped by a second pair of guards, they mistake her for a boy. But, as if to remind us that we're not there quite yet, Arya plays her royalty card and proudly asserts that she's Arya, the daughter of Ned Stark, clapping back at the guards for demeaning her. You just have to love how layered every little scene is. The characterization is on point and the foreshadowing is bonkers, because Arya is going to spend a lot of her story completely separated from her family and being mistaken for a peasant boy. When she gets to Ned, he scolds her for disappearing before she spills what she heard in the dungeons, or what she could understand. Jory enters and announces that Yoren from the Night's Watch is here to see Ned. Yoren introduces himself and we get yet another setup for Arya's future cross-dressing shenanigans.
This must be your son. He has the look.
I'm a girl.
Ned Ned concernedly asks,
Did Benjen send you?
And when Yoren says,
No one sent me, my lord. I'm here to find men for the wall.
Ned says,
We'll find recruits for you.
And I love this little smile, like he's so relieved that for once there's no added bullshit. But there is added bullshit.
It's about your wife, my lord. She's taken the imp.
Ned makes his way to the king to discuss the impending shit show in private, but a messenger intercepts him, telling him that Robert is at the small council meeting waiting for him. Ned fears that it's about his wife, but it turns out to be about Daenerys Targaryen. Before we discuss this meeting, let's have a peek at a scene from episode 2. It's loads of fun and sets up the conflict between Robert and Ned really well. At the time, Robert's fear was,
soon enough that child will spread her legs and start breeding.
And now that fear has been realized. Ned, understandably, draws the line at killing children. While Ned may be super honorable, and he would probably have this stance regardless, he is definitely thinking of Jon every time the issue is raised. Earlier in the same conversation, the two are reminiscing about war times when the topic of Jon's mother comes up. When Robert points out that Ned never told him what Jon's mother looked like, Ned replies with sadness and a hint of scorn.
You never told me what she looked like.
No, will I?
Ned still hasn't gotten over what the Lannisters did to the Targaryen children, and he was deeply disappointed in Robert for not punishing their crime, made all the worse by his discovery of Jon shortly after. This is why Ned never tries to see Robert after he becomes king. Bobby B didn't give the order to kill the Targaryen children, but he in no small way endorsed it. What's more is Robert has decided this should be the policy applied to all Targaryens.
I'll kill every Targaryen I get my hands on.
Bruh, chill.
Ned is still very miffed about this. He has had to make a shit ton of sacrifices and hurt his own family to prevent his own best friend from killing his sister's son. But one could wonder if Ned was being too careful. Perhaps he wasn't giving Robert enough credit. Imagine if Robert had been the one to find Lyanna with Jon. Maybe instead of going Anakin on the little bastard, he would spare his life for the sake of Lyanna. After all, for all his talk about slaying every last Targaryen, he's been keeping tabs on these two very alive Targaryens for years. He only started getting antsy when Dany was married to Khal Drogo, and now he only acts because she is pregnant. But even if Robert might have spared Jon, he is now giving the order to kill Viserys, Dany, and her unborn child.
You'll dishonor yourself forever if you do this.
I've got 7 kingdoms to rule! Do you think honor keeps them in line? It's fear! Fear and blood!
Robert may be a little too emotionally invested in this assassination, but from a purely utilitarian perspective, this is kind of the correct move.
Should the gods grant Daenerys a son, the realm will bleed.
This sort of grand calculus approach to ethics can feel icky, but these are the kinds of tough choices people in power have to make if they are truly worried about sparing innocent lives.
Is it not wiser that she should die now, so that tens of thousands might live?
And yeah, the big meme is that Robert ultimately ends up being right, and Ned was a chump for trying to save Adolf Targaryen. But without the benefit of hindsight, this is quite the dilemma. Yeah, the Dothraki have never crossed the Narrow Sea, and yeah, Dany's son could have zero interest in Westeros when he's older. Ned and Robert went to war in part to get justice for what was done to the Stark family. The whole point of the rebellion was to remove a tyrant who went to extreme lengths to preserve his hold on power. If they do this,
then we're no better than the Mad King.
Which sounds a bit extreme, but this is Ned's whole MO. To him, there is far more to be lost if Robert commits to murdering a child, meaning he clings to his principles because, as he knows, momentarily abandoning your principles for the sake of personal gain means you don't truly hold those principles. He gives Jaime no credit for turning on the Mad King because, from his perspective, Jaime made that choice at a time when it was most convenient and safe for himself. Ned embodies what it means to truly live your values, to make sacrifices for what you believe is right. He would sooner face a Dothraki horde than condone the death of a single child.
I followed you into war twice, without doubts, without second thoughts. But I will not follow you now.
Ned sees right through Robert's bluster. He isn't making this decision out of an obligation to defend his country or a commitment to maintaining peace. He's making this choice out of his own hatred and fear. Ned says,
"The Robert I grew up with didn't tremble at the shadow of an unborn child."
And Robert says, "You'll do as I command, or I'll find me a hand who will." And Ned's like, "Bet."
I thought you were a better man.
Robert tells Ned to fuck right off, and Ned fucks right off. I love how Robert reins himself in and takes it on the chin when Ned refuses to follow the order. He even tanks the hit when Ned flatly says he's a diminished version of what he once was. But it's Ned resigning his hand, deciding once again to abandon Robert and return to Winterfell, that causes him to snap. Between this, Jon Arryn's assassination, and Tyrion's abduction, Ned finally decides that King's Landing might not be the healthiest environment for him and his daughters.
I'll go ahead with my daughters. Get them ready. Do it yourself. Don't ask anyone for help.
This tidbit of dialogue, Ned saying don't ask anyone for help, shows that he might be something of a doofus, but he has been learning the ways of the Red Keep. But then Littlefinger shows up.
If you're still here come nightfall, I'll take you to see the last person Jon Arryn spoke with before falling ill.
You know, Ned, now would have been a great time to ask.
I'd been in the capital a month. Why have you waited so long to tell me this?
But instead, Ned says that he doesn't have time. Which, hey, that's still a decent answer to the obvious ploy to keep you in the capital a bit longer. But when Peter tells him it will only take an hour, Ned caves.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Meanwhile, Cat and Tyrion arrive outside the castle of House Arryn, the Eyrie, probably the most implausible looking castle in the show by far, and I don't hate it, but I much prefer the changes they made to it in season 4. And I'm still not decided on which I like better, but I do really appreciate the much more grounded rendition that exists in season 2 of House of the Dragon.
They say it's impregnable. Give me 10 good men and some climbing spikes. I'll impregnate the bitch.
Once inside, we meet Lysa Arryn, Catelyn's sister and Jon Arryn's widow. And here we meet Sweet Robin.
I want to see the bad man fly.
This is some sneaky setup for the Vale's preferred method of execution. Gravity. Tyrion gets introduced to this absolute specimen and the Sky Cells. On my first viewing, I wondered if these might have been little dragon roosts from a previous era, but it turns out they're just a fancy method of torture, execution, and imprisonment. One detail I wish they had kept from the books is that the floor of each cell has a slight outward slope to it. We get teased with this idea, but not shown it. I was gonna talk about Renly, but I can fit everything I want to say about him into one video, so I'll save that for a season 2 video when he becomes more important. Also, I just really want to get to this next part. We open on Robert, sitting there looking real sad. And then Cersei enters, doing what all good wives do when their husband is heartbroken. Makes fun of him for being gay.
I'm sorry your marriage to Ned Stark didn't work out.
The sadness and defeat in Robert's voice and body language is so real. His anger has subsided and now he silently mourns losing his best friend. Cersei asks if it was worth losing Ned this way, and Robert says he doesn't know. But he lays out what he does know. And this time he does so without any of the fear or vitriol he had before. If Dany convinces Drogo to cross the Narrow Sea and invade Westeros,
we won't be able to stop them.
Cersei asserts that the Dothraki would never cross the sea to begin with, and even if they did, they're primitive compared to Westeros. But Robert starts to cook, playing out a hypothetical invasion. Even he knows it would be stupid to face the Dothraki in open combat, so the smartest move would be to fortify within the castles. But while all the nobility is cooped up in their strongholds, the Dothraki won't just sit around waiting for the gates to open. They'll comb through the countryside and start pillaging the citizens, reaving and raping every Westerosi they can get their hands on.
When did the people decide that Viserys Targaryen is the rightful monarch after all? How long do the people of the Seven Kingdoms stand behind their absentee king?
After watching him goof around for 4 episodes, it's so engaging to see the side of him. She remarks that they still have the Dothraki outnumbered, but Robert makes the point that 5 is only quantitatively greater than 1, not qualitatively. Except, you know, he words it a lot better.
5. 1. One army, united behind one leader with one purpose.
Robert goes on to say that the realm is now divided. The country is now just a playground for the other lords to have their games. Everyone is out for their own ends and they all want something different.
What do you want?
Robert raising the glass indicates that he is content to drink and whore as he has been. But you don't have to be an expert in psychology to realize he drinks and whores precisely because he craves something else. He continues, saying the realm isn't prepared for a fight. All it is now is backstabbing, arse-licking, and money-grubbing.
Sometimes I don't know what holds it together.
Our marriage.
Them sharing this laugh is the most intimate we ever see them. Briefly, the walls come down and the two partake in a surprisingly touching moment together.
Don't you get tired?
Every day.
The same way Robert dreamed of a life he might have with Lyanna, Cersei had longed to be Rhaegar's queen, and she pictured her life with him as idyllically as Robert pictured his future with Lyanna. Both would have preferred radically different spouses, so both resent each other for coming along and replacing their untempered dreams with a cold and cruel reality. In a later conversation where Cersei spills all the beans to Ned, she reveals that her marriage to Robert initially brought her great joy, but only for a meager few hours, until it came time for them to consummate their marriage.
And that night he crawled on top of me stinking of wine and did what little he could do, and whispered in my ear, Lyanna. What was she like?
You've never asked about her, not once. Why not?
She answers that at first, saying Lyanna's name felt like breathing life back into her. She hoped not asking might help Robert forget about Lyanna more easily. When that didn't work, she refused to ask out of spite. Robert leans in. He says, "Do you want to know the horrible truth?"
I can't even remember what she looked like. I only know she was the one thing I ever wanted.
Mark Addy killed this delivery. He nailed it all season, but with such a limited role, he didn't get nearly as many chances to shine as his cast members, which is why I'm really glad Dave and Dan decided to make this scene, probably their best addition to the show.
Someone took her away from me, and 7 kingdoms couldn't fill the hole she left behind.
Cersei tells Robert that she held on to her affection for him for quite some time after the death of their first son. Of all the characters you would expect to have such an open and vulnerable conversation, these two are not them. But it happened and it was executed brilliantly, so I've got no complaints. And because Robert's death is kind of imminent, now is a good time to wrap up my analysis of his character, starting with this line.
I can't even remember what she looked like.
Robert's grief is palpable here. You would really believe he loved Lyanna just based on how long he's been grieving her death. But with all the context, we know that he and Lyanna never had much of a romantic relationship. So the idea of Robert falling madly in love with her suggests that he was more in love with the idea of her than who she actually was as a person. Notice the dialogue here. She was the one thing I ever wanted. But what was this idea? Well, think about what a life married to Lyanna would have meant for Robert. If you remember the very first episode, Robert spells out his true motivation right away.
We were meant to rule together. If your sister had lived, we'd have been bound by blood. Well, it's not too late. I have a son, you have a daughter. We'll join our houses.
Robert only misses Lyanna so much now because in retrospect, his marriage to her might have kept Ned in his life. And note how Robert didn't get fat until right after the Greyjoy Rebellion, which was the last time he and Ned were together. I think the Greyjoy Rebellion showed Robert that Ned was committed to keeping his distance unless commanded otherwise. Realizing that his best friend would never willingly come back into his life must have been devastating, and his current condition is a result of him trying to fill the Ned-shaped hole in his heart. In spite of being such a fun and bodacious character, Robert's story is surprisingly sweet and tragic, because all he really wants is to have his best friend back in his life.
What do you say, just you and me on the King's Road, swords at our sides?
And we're not done with this line.
I can't even remember what she looked like.
Some of you might recall this line from 2 episodes earlier, when Robert is talking about the people he killed in the rebellion.
Yes, it's been a long time, but I still remember every face.
He remembers the faces of all his victims, but he can't remember the face of his beloved. Robert adjusted to violence as he aged, but being a kid at the outbreak of the rebellion means he faced combat long before he was ready to process so much death. He's still racked with guilt and confusion over the first person he killed. As time passes, Robert has a harder time remembering the things that made him happy, and an even harder time forgetting all the things that make him miserable. So to cope with the critically low levels of joy and purpose in his life, he shirks his duties, bullies his intern, and gets white girl wasted whenever possible. What a fantastic character. What a fantastic performance. We shall never see his like again. We jump to Littlefinger's brothel where Ned is speaking to a woman holding her baby. The woman turns out to be one of many whores Robert has sampled, and the baby turns out to be one of the many bastards he's created. Ned asks Baelish how many bastards Robert has and why Jon Arryn was tracking them down. Peter feigns ignorance, speculating that maybe Robert ordered this be done out of fatherly love for his bastards. When they step outside, they meet a dozen Lannister spears led by Jaime, who says he's looking for his brother.
Blonde hair, sharp tongue, short man.
He was taken at my command.
Ned covering for his wife and taking the credit is a Chad move, but perhaps a bit reckless when Jaime is clearly looking for a fight. Swords are drawn and Jaime threatens to kill Ned. Ned reminds Jaime that if he dies, so does Tyrion.
You're right. Take him alive. Kill us Ned.
Jory's 2 best swords get javelined like a couple of chumps, and Jory gets stabbed through the eye by Jaime. Ned and Jaime exchange swords, and I'm not a fan of the obnoxious number of cuts. Hey, I do in my videos to avoid copyright, leave me alone. Jaime is having the time of his life dueling Ned, and is very grumpy when one of his men ends the fun by skewering Ned in the leg. As always, there's a bit more going on under the surface. Jaime is haunted by his choice to kill the Mad King, not because of the choice itself, but because of how it sullied his reputation forever. Ned was the one who found him on the throne, the first one to learn he had killed the Mad King, and the first to condemn him for it. On top of that, Ned is also famed for slaying Sir Arthur Dayne, possibly the greatest swordsman who ever lived, and a hero to many young swordsmen like Jaime. Jaime probably doubts that Ned bested Dayne in combat, and was chomping at the bit for a chance to perhaps expose the honorable Ned as a fraud, finally silencing and disgracing his biggest detractor. Or if Ned was really all he's cracked up to be, then Jaime defeating him would sort of cement him as the greatest swordsman of all, better than Arthur Dayne himself. This spear dude stepping in to interfere undermines the fair fight Jaime needed for either of those outcomes. Jaime flees the scene, telling Ned he wants his brother back, or else, and it's all downhill from here. This episode is really fucking good. It's undeniably Robert's episode. We get an exploration of him at his most jovial and his most somber. We have Ned descending even further into the rabbit hole and reaching his absolute limit with King's Landing. Varys versus Littlefinger is always a fun time. Arya gets crazy helpings of foreshadowing. The Hound has his first heroic moment, and like, holy shit, did you even realize this season introduced 42 main characters? And I mean major characters, that's not counting squibblins like Jory and Rickon. This is what made the show so engaging. It didn't matter what location or character you cut to, you were always excited to see more because every aspect of this story was crafted with so much talent and intent. It's not as flashy as in episode 9 or 10, but it's important to remember that the finales are only so strong because of the legwork put in by less action-heavy episodes like this. It may not be one of my personal favorites, but The Wolf and the Lion is a standout episode in the best written season of the show, and for that it deserves to be discussed. It deserves to be remembered. It deserves the title, Best of Thrones. And that's all, folks. Thanks for sticking around. If getting into the highest ring of heaven after you die is something that interests you, then you better go to my Patreon in the description right now and
give me money. Money now. Me a money needing a lot now.
If not, perhaps one of the lower rings of heaven might interest you. You can get into them by liking or leaving a comment on this video, or by creating a second account solely to subscribe to my channel. I don't make the rules, I only convey the Lord of Light's wisdom as I interpret it. I gave a big thank you to all of my OG subscribers in my Mando video, but it appears you're all hopeless dragon nerds, so most of you missed it. So again, a big thank you to everyone who has subscribed. I'm really sorry this video kept getting delayed, but a lot kept getting in the way. I kept fucking with it because I wasn't liking how it was turning out, and I fucked with it so much for so long that my motivation zeroed out more than a couple times. The channel has done a lot better than I expected, and while I can't promise a more consistent upload schedule, I can promise that I will continue to work on content, and I've already started several other scripts. Now that I've gotten this one wrapped up, I hope to branch out into other shows. My main goal is still to cover early Game of Thrones in its entirety, so I will pretty much always have a Best of Thrones video cooking in the background. And in case you didn't know, I've already made unscripted breakdowns of the first 4 episodes of season 1, and I'll be making one of these for each episode that doesn't get a Best of Thrones video. If by some miracle you're still here, thank you so much for watching all the way through to the end. In the name of the Wombo, I bless you.